China makes an offer Iran cannot refuse. Acquire virtually all of Iran's oil exports. The world gasps. Markets convulse. Rivals scramble. And alliances teeter. This is not fantasy. This is a scenario rooted in real energy dependencies, sanctions, evasion, and strategic ambition. Today, we know how Beijing could dominate Tehran's oil and what comes crashing afterward. Before we begin, if you value clarity in a world of spin, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support helps bring rigorous geopolitical insight to a distracted world. This video is for educational and analytical purposes only. It does not promote or condone coercive economic warfare or political aggression. Section 1. Why China and Iran already orbit each other. For decades, Iran has searched for a lifeline, a way to break free from the economic siege imposed by Western sanctions. And halfway across Asia, China has been searching for something just as vital: energy security. These two ambitions, seemingly separate, are slowly converging into one of the most consequential economic partnerships of our time. Since the United States reimposed sanctions in 2018, Iran's traditional oil buyers from India to Europe have largely vanished. Yet somehow, Iranian oil still flows. Tankers slip through maritime shadows, their tracking signals turned off, their cargo relabeled as Malaysian or Omani. And when those ships finally dock, their destination is almost always the same Chinese ports. By 2025, analysts estimate China is quietly importing over 1.4 million barrels of Iranian crude every day, more than half of Iran's total production. This isn't a coincidence. It's a carefully constructed lifeline, built through front companies, barter deals, and ghost fleets operating beyond the reach of US satellites. But it's not just trade, it's strategy. In 2021, the two nations signed a 25-year comprehensive strategic cooperation agreement. On paper, it promises up to $400 billion in Chinese investments across Iranian infrastructure, ports, railways, and telecommunications in exchange for a long-term, heavily discounted supply of oil and gas. In reality, it's Beijing buying influence, one barrel at a time. For Iran, the deal offers survival. Years of sanctions have gutted its economy, slashed foreign reserves, and isolated its banking system. With China, Tehran finds not just a buyer but a shield, a superpower willing to defy Washington's economic order. For China, Iran represents both opportunity and leverage: access to cheap energy, strategic footholds near the Persian Gulf, and a partner hostile to the United States. This unspoken alliance is reinforced by technology transfers, drone cooperation, and shared opposition to Western dominance. Chinese-made surveillance systems monitor Iranian streets. Iranian drones, modeled on Chinese designs, fly across Middle Eastern battlefields. Step by step, China and Iran are binding their fates together, one through necessity, the other through ambition. And if the day ever comes when Beijing decides to buy every drop of Iranian oil, it won't be a sudden revolution. It will simply be the next move in a long game that's already underway. Section 2. The Great Exchange: How the Oil for Influence game works. Imagine this. Beijing announces a historic deal. China will officially purchase all of Iran's oil exports under a 20-year agreement. The numbers are staggering. More than 2 million barrels per day, worth over $150 billion annually. To most of the world, it sounds like a trade deal. But in geopolitical reality, it's a weapon, a transaction that shifts global power lines. Here's why. Every barrel of oil sold to China undercuts the West's sanction regime. It tells the world that U.S. economic warfare can be bypassed if you have Beijing's backing. Overnight, Iran's crippled economy revives. Its currency stabilizes. New pipelines, ports, and data networks, all built by Chinese engineers, start stitching the Islamic Republic into China's Belt and Road web. But there's more beneath the surface. In exchange for energy access, China doesn't just pay in dollars. It pays in infrastructure. It builds ports in Bandar Abbas, rail lines from Tehran to Gwadar, cybersecurity systems, and 5G networks that operate under Chinese protocols. These aren't just economic tools, they're strategic anchors. Each construction site doubles as a listening post, each cable as a channel of influence. And soon, Iran isn't just selling oil, it's trading sovereignty. Beijing gains long-term control over critical energy routes, access to Iranian military data, and even the ability to project influence into the Persian Gulf, a region once dominated by the U.S. Fifth Fleet. For the West, this deal would be a nightmare. Washington's sanctions regime, the cornerstone of its pressure on Iran, collapses. European energy markets panic as oil prices swing unpredictably. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, already wary of China's expansion, feel cornered. The petrodollar system, the invisible glue of American power, begins to fray. Meanwhile, Chinese tankers sail safely through the Strait of Hormuz, protected by Iranian naval escorts. The message to the world is clear. Energy independence now flows eastward. Beijing calls it partnership, Washington calls it provocation, Tehran calls it freedom. But in truth, it's a quiet revolution, one where barrels replace bullets, pipelines replace front lines, and economics becomes the new battlefield. And as the ink dries on this deal, the question haunting every Western strategist is simple. How long before oil becomes the next trigger for global confrontation? Section 3. The U.S. response. Sanctions, allies, and escalation. The news hits Washington like a thunderclap. Overnight, the United States watches its two longtime adversaries, China and Iran, forge the most consequential oil deal of the decade. Inside the White House Situation Room, the question isn't if America should respond, but how fast. Sanctions are the first weapon drawn. Treasury officials rush to blacklist every Chinese shipping company, every tanker, every insurer connected to the deal. But it's a losing battle. Beijing has prepared for this moment for years with its own fleet of dark tankers, barter systems, and a digital currency infrastructure designed to bypass the U.S. dominated SWIFT network. The yuan, not the dollar, begins settling Iran's oil trade. For the U.S., this isn't just an economic challenge, it's an ideological one. The foundation of American global influence has always been control of energy and finance. Now, both are slipping. So, Washington pivots to diplomacy. It rallies allies Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and India under the banner of the Indo-Pacific Energy Freedom Initiative. The goal: contain China's energy reach and secure alternative routes through Southeast Asia. American aircraft carriers reposition in the Arabian Sea, while strategic bombers patrol the South China Sea skies. But Beijing is 2 steps ahead. Chinese naval ships begin escorting oil convoys through the Indian Ocean, operating near U.S. maritime zones. A direct challenge not seen since the Cold War. Tensions rise as both sides shadow each other's fleets. Meanwhile, Europe fractures. Some nations, desperate for cheap energy amid global shortages, quietly support China's deal. Others side with Washington, fearing a future where Beijing dominates global oil flows. NATO intelligence meetings grow tense. Diplomats whisper, "Are we watching the birth of a new bipolar energy world?" And then comes the economic aftershock. Global oil markets convulse. The price per barrel surges past $150. Inflation spikes worldwide. Developing nations face energy blackouts. Public anger spreads, and so does political instability. Inside the Pentagon, analysts warn, this isn't just about oil, it's about order. The U.S. now faces a hard truth. The unipolar world it built after the Cold War is fading, replaced by a multipolar chessboard where China writes new rules. For Washington, one decision remains: escalate with force, or adapt to a new reality where Beijing controls the world's most powerful energy lifeline. Section 4. The Middle East shifts. Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the new energy axis. As China's oil tankers roll steadily out of Iranian ports, the Middle East enters a new and uncertain era. The old energy order built on petrodollars, American protection, and Saudi dominance begins to crack. In its place, a new axis of power takes shape, one that binds Beijing and Tehran together and challenges decades of U.S. influence across the region. Saudi Arabia, long America's cornerstone in the Gulf, finds itself cornered by a hard choice. On one hand, it cannot ignore China, its largest customer, and a rising technological partner. On the other, the kingdom's entire defense architecture, from F-15 jets to Patriot missile batteries, still depends on Washington. Inside Riyadh's royal palace, quiet debates erupt. Should the future be written in yuan or in dollars? Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman studies the landscape carefully. China's deal with Iran threatens to upend OPEC's balance. If Beijing can guarantee oil purchases outside the U.S. financial system, Saudi Arabia risks losing leverage over global prices. Yet aligning too closely with America risks alienating the world's largest energy consumer, China. For Riyadh, neutrality might no longer be an option. Across the region, Israel watches with alarm. For years, it relied on quiet U.S. dominance in the Gulf to contain Iran. But now that order is shifting. A China-backed Iran, flush with revenue, technology, and diplomatic support, becomes a far more formidable adversary. Israeli intelligence warns China's money could rebuild Iran's missile program in months, not years. In Tel Aviv, military planners begin adjusting their doctrine. The next conflict may not just involve Hezbollah or Hamas. It could unfold under the shadow of a Chinese-Iranian alliance that emboldens Tehran to act more aggressively in Syria, Lebanon, or the Strait of Hormuz. Meanwhile, the rest of the Middle East recalibrates. The United Arab Emirates and Qatar hedge their bets, signing parallel investment deals with both Washington and Beijing. Turkey positions itself as a neutral hub for East-West energy trade. Iraq sees opportunity, selling oil to both powers while deepening ties with Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. In less than a year, the geopolitical map of the Middle East begins to redraw itself, not through war, but through oil contracts and currency swaps. The American century in the Gulf is waning. The Chinese century may already be beginning. Section 5. Global Economic Fallout, De-dollarization, and the New Oil Order. When China decides to buy all of Iran's oil, not in US dollars, but in yuan, the shock doesn't stop at the Middle East. It spreads across the global financial system, threatening to dismantle one of America's greatest strategic advantages, the petrodollar. Since the 1970s, every barrel of oil traded on the world market has reinforced the dollar's supremacy. Nations needed U.S. currency to buy energy, and that demand gave Washington unmatched leverage. Sanctions worked because they could choke access to the dollar-based system. Financial power became geopolitical power. But China's all-in deal with Iran changes that equation. Suddenly, billions of barrels of oil are being traded in digital yuan, not dollars. Beijing builds a new payment network, insulated from U.S. oversight. Other nations, from Russia to Venezuela, take notice. For the first time in half a century, the world sees a viable alternative to the dollar-dominated system. At first, Wall Street dismisses it as symbolic. But when reports confirm that Iran's oil exports have rebounded to pre-sanctions levels and global demand for dollars dips, panic begins to spread quietly in financial circles. U.S. Treasury analysts warn that even a 5% reduction in dollar-based energy trade could ripple through bond markets, weakening America's borrowing power. Then comes the next shock. Saudi Arabia, still dependent on China as its top buyer, begins to accept limited yuan payments for crude sales. This move, once unthinkable, sends a message. The world's largest oil exporter is testing a post-dollar system. Within months, smaller producers like Angola and Nigeria join in, eager to diversify trade with Beijing. In Washington, the alarms grow louder. Lawmakers call it economic warfare. The Pentagon labels China's oil gambit a non-kinetic weapon. But outside the West, many see it differently, as a long overdue correction to decades of U.S. dominance. The Petroyuan is not just a currency shift, it's a political statement. Energy markets fracture into competing blocs, one centered around the dollar, another around the yuan. The global economy begins to split in two. For the first time in modern history, the question isn't who controls oil, but who controls the currency of oil. And the answer may decide the future of global power. Section 6. U.S. retaliation, sanctions, cyber warfare, and strategic containment. When China makes its move, buying Iran's oil entirely in yuan, Washington cannot stay silent. The world's most powerful financial and military machine suddenly finds itself challenged not by missiles, but by money. At the Pentagon and the Treasury Department, emergency task forces are convened. Intelligence cables describe it as a direct assault on the dollar order. The White House debates options, each with escalating consequences. The first response comes fast. Sanctions 2. The U.S. Treasury targets Chinese state-owned banks, oil traders, and shipping insurers involved in Iran's exports. Washington pressures allies in Europe and Asia to halt transactions with Chinese refiners using yuan. But this time, the results are mixed. The world has changed. Many nations, weary of dollar dominance and wary of losing access to China's vast market, quietly ignore U.S. warnings. So, Washington shifts strategy. Behind the scenes, cyber operations ramp up. Reports emerge of mysterious disruptions in Chinese port logistics and Iranian oil loading systems. Anonymous leaks hint that American cyber units are probing China's new digital payment infrastructure, testing vulnerabilities, sending a warning. In parallel, the U.S. Navy increases its presence in the Persian Gulf and the South China Sea, the twin flashpoints of this economic war. Aircraft carriers stage freedom of navigation drills, while surveillance planes shadow Chinese tankers en route to Iranian ports. Officially, it's about ensuring global trade stability. Unofficially, it's containment, a reminder that American power still commands the seas. Meanwhile, diplomacy turns frostier. The G7 issues a joint statement condemning the UN oil deal as a violation of sanctions law. China fires back, accusing the U.S. of weaponizing the global financial system. The UN Security Council becomes a theater of accusations, as Washington pushes for a new embargo resolution that Beijing and Moscow veto immediately. Behind the headlines, Wall Street begins to feel the tremors. Sanctions on Chinese banks spark uncertainty in global credit markets. U.S. tech firms fear retaliation through supply chain restrictions. For the first time in decades, economic warfare feels two-sided. Washington's message is clear. It won't let the petrodollar crumble without a fight. But China's message is equally clear. It no longer plays by American rules. And caught between them, the rest of the world begins preparing for a new era of divided finance, divided trade, and divided power. Section 7. The Middle East realignment. Iran's rise and Saudi Arabia's gamble. As the UN oil alliance deepens, the Middle East begins to tilt quietly but decisively toward Beijing. In Tehran, the mood shifts from defiance to triumph. Billions of yuan pour into the central bank of Iran. Sanctions no longer bite the same way. Chinese engineers swarm Iran's refineries, expanding capacity and upgrading pipelines. In return, Beijing gains access to ports in the Persian Gulf gateways for the new energy Silk Road linking China to the west through land and sea. For Iran, this isn't just about economics. It's geopolitical resurrection. A nation long isolated by Western sanctions now finds itself at the center of an emerging bloc, one that includes China, Russia, and increasingly, the Gulf states themselves. But the real shock comes from Riyadh. Saudi Arabia, once the cornerstone of the U.S. petrodollar system, begins hedging its bets. Facing pressure from Washington on human rights and defense deals, Saudi leaders open discreet talks with Beijing exploring UN settlements for limited oil trades. For the first time since 1974, the petrodollar pact no longer looks unbreakable. Across the region, alliances realign. Iraq boosts oil exports to China. The UAE signs infrastructure deals tied to yuan payment systems. Even smaller players like Oman and Qatar seek to diversify their currency baskets. The economic gravity of the Middle East begins shifting eastward toward Shanghai, not New York. Meanwhile, the U.S. presence in the region weakens. Bases remain, but influence fades. American diplomats warn that the Middle East is entering a new Cold War alignment, but few listen. The promise of Chinese trade and infrastructure is simply too tempting for struggling economies. In the long run, this transformation isn't just about oil. It's about trust, leverage, and the future of global power. A UN-based oil market means Beijing doesn't just buy energy, it buys influence, ports, votes, and silence in international forums. The balance that once defined the global order, the American dollar versus the world's resources, begins to fracture. China buying Iran's entire oil market is not just about crude and revenue. It's a bold gambit to rewire global energy politics, economics, and security. The ripple effects, sanctions, alliances, military tension could reshape the 21st century order. If you found this deep dive helpful, like, comment your perspective, and subscribe for more geopolitical analysis. Turn on notifications, future energy wars are closer than you think. Thank you for watching GeoPower Report.